back on my BS again! It's time for another Fate episode. I've said it a couple times already, but one of the things I like the most about the Fate series is that the very concept of heroic spirits drawn across world history and mythology lends itself to opportunities where I can discuss parts of the world that haven't gotten as much of a presence in the medium of video games as a whole. There are plenty of video games set in Japan, the United States, China, France, and otherwise fictional worlds strongly based on such locales, which Fate certainly represents in its long catalog of heroic spirits, but I hesitate to think of many video games where Hungary is featured with much prominence, if any at all. And that strikes me as a bit odd, given Hungary's unique cultural flavor from the rest of Europe, as well as its many old folk tales and vibrant history. And yet, here I am, about to talk about one of the most infamous figures in Hungarian history. Prospective video game developers, take note. Please make more games based on Hungarian culture. I am this close to begging you. So yeah, I've been itching for pretty much any good opportunity to talk about something pertaining to Hungary. And, wouldn't you know it, Fate Extra CCC started such an opportunity for discussion through the inclusion of Elizabeth Bathory as a servant, and one who would end up playing a recurring role throughout both the Fate Extra timeline and the behemoth salt mine that is Fate Grand Order. And speaking of Grand Order, it even added another heroic spirit related to Liz, the Iron Maiden-wielding assassin-class servant Carmilla. Originally, I had planned to talk about these two for a Halloween-themed episode, but the idea for an episode on Baron Samedi from Smite took precedence when I decided it was better to take a break from Fate content. But 8 months have passed since then, and I can bear the wait no longer. With our wonderful opportunity now outlined, why don't we spend some time discussing what bit of Hungary we can all learn from Fate's interpretation of Elizabeth Bathory? Well, Elizabeth before she became a mean character, that is. I'm the Kitsune Hawk, and today I get to finally discuss part of the history and folklore attached to the land of the Magyars, as interpreted by not one, but two characters within Type Moon's Fate franchise. So get out your pencils, trivia enthusiasts, because this is character development. Before we can properly begin, I need to elaborate on a few points, starting with the relationship between Elizabeth Bathory and Carmilla within the lore of Fate. Technically speaking, both servants are based on the same historical figure, but they emphasize different aspects of said figure and are essentially two different portrayals because of that. I've talked about a similar case with Vlad III in a previous episode of this show, though hopefully this time I can actually do it properly. Just like before, I'll be discussing both Elizabeth and Carmilla interchangeably, depending on whichever character the relevant information best applies to. But as far as Elizabeth specifically is concerned, I'm only going to be discussing her basic Lancer class incarnation, as well as the Berserker class form she takes on in Fate Extra CCC. I won't be going over any of her alternate versions from Grand Order, seeing as they're basically their own, largely unrelated thing. Second, for the sake of distinction and clarity, I'll be using the anglicized pronunciation of Elizabeth Bathory if I am referring to her counterpart in Fate, and if I am referring to the historical figure, I will instead attempt to use the Hungarian pronunciation and naming convention of Bathory Erzsébet. And third, for any Hungarian viewers who might be watching today, I apologize for how badly I am probably going to butcher your beautiful language. Now then, let's properly return to that first point, about the relationship between Elizabeth and Carmilla. What do I mean when I say that they're two portrayals of the same historical figure? Well, to summarize, they're both based on a woman named Bathory Erzsébet, a Hungarian countess from the late 16th and early 17th century who is widely attributed as being the most prolific female serial killer in history. More details to follow in the coming minutes. Between the two, Carmilla embodies the infamy and legends of Bathory Erzsébet, the person that history generally remembers, whereas the one that's actually named Elizabeth Bathory is an incarnation of the Countess at age 14. Too young to be the serial killer that people recognize, but still expressing some of her negative personality traits, as well as some visual elements related to her family heritage. A proper understanding of how these two emphasize different parts of the real-life Bathory Erzsébet through their personalities, designs, and skill sets thus requires that our history lesson for today will need to go back a bit and cover who the Bathory family were, and why they were important by the time Erzsébet was garnering her reputation as a murderer. The House of Báthory was a highly influential family in not only Hungary, but much of Central Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods. Within their 3 centuries of socio-political prominence, members of the Báthory family served as regional bishops and renowned scholars, as palatines or viceroys to the King of Hungary, as princes and voivodes of Transylvania, and, at one point, as the king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But in spite of all the achievements they had worked toward over time, the Báthory family is primarily remembered outside of Hungary because of Erzsébet and her record as a serial killer. The House of Báthory was formed in the late medieval period by Báthory Berek, after he and his brothers had received the settlement of Bátor, or Nyírbátor, from King László IV in 1279, though Berek himself didn't change his surname to Báthory until 1310, when he became the sole ruler of the area. The name itself simply meant of or from Bátor, though I'd like to at least mention that the name of the land itself doubles as the Hungarian word for brave or valiant. The family's influence began to spread as early as its 2nd generation, through the formation of the Somlyó branch, descended from Berek's eldest son, Báthory János, and the Ecsed branch, descended from Berek's youngest son, Báthory Lakasz. This division of authority allowed the Báthory family to rule from multiple regions in Hungary, and by the end of the 14th century, they were governing estates across northern and northeastern Hungary. Nobles from the House of Báthory expressed their heightened political importance in the 15th century by serving as members of the Order of the Dragon, a confederation of rulers united to resist the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire and other perceived enemies of Christianity. Although the Order of the Dragon would lose most of its original influence by the turn of the 16th century, the dragon remained a central symbol of the Báthory family largely because of their prior membership. The House of Báthory's coat of arms featured a trio of dragon fangs across a red field. At times, it also included the green, cross-bearing drake that denoted membership in the Order of the Dragon. There also exists a particular legend that the Báthory family took its coat of arms from the deeds of a mythical ancestor in the 10th century, who had made a name for himself by slaying a swamp dragon that had long terrified the people of Ecsed. Though this story doesn't match the historical record of the family, and was most likely made up as a way to justify their rule, or perhaps celebrate their heritage. In many ways, the 16th century was both the highest point for the House of Báthory, as well as their last hurrah. Despite Hungary itself being shattered and partitioned in the aftermath of the 1526 Battle of Mohács, this century marked the time when the Báthory family became closest to the Hungarian monarchy, improved their relations with the von Habsburgs of Austria, and even held the throne of Poland-Lithuania for a decade. And it was also in this period that Báthory Erzsébet put her name into the history books. Raised as a Calvinist in a principally Catholic part of Europe, Erzsébet received an education that included fluency in 4 languages, a sign of the privilege and wealth that the Báthory family had amassed, since most Hungarian aristocrats at the time tended to be illiterate. She was also descended from both the Somlyó and Ecsed branches of her family, because it just isn't a story about pre-modern European monarchs unless there's incest somewhere. At the age of 10, Erzsébet was betrothed to Nádasdy Ferenc, a boy from a noble family that was comparatively lower in rank. The two married in 1575, when Erzsébet was 15 and Ferenc was 19, and the newly made husband gave a special wedding gift to his wife, a personal court at Chita Castle, located in what is today Western Slovakia. Because Ferenc was often called upon to lead parts of the Hungarian army against the Ottomans, Erzsébet oversaw the affairs of their estates, and it would not be long into their marriage when she began to accrue her infamy. Despite her husband's frequent absences, the couple managed to produce 3 daughters and 1 son between 1585 and 1598. Erzsébet was described as being a caring mother, but repeated childbirth had taken a clear toll on her body, and she grew increasingly concerned that she was losing her natural beauty. This mix of distress and vanity became the catalyst for her crimes. As the legend goes, Erzsébet was in the process of disciplining one of her maidservants when she struck the poor girl hard enough to draw blood. Some of the blood dripped onto the Countess's hand, and she claimed that the skin around the contact points had somehow revitalized back to a youthful state. She then gave an order to have the maid stripped naked and cut repeatedly, with a vessel below to collect the remaining blood in her body, which Erzsébet then bathed in. Fully convinced that she had found a way to restore and preserve her youth, Batri Ejebet began to systematically induct more and more young virgin girls as maidservants, only to then torture and bleed them dry so that she could enjoy another one of her literal bloodbaths. The victims were given private burials, at least until there were too many bodies to properly dispose of, calling for more creative and unorthodox methods of hiding. In 1604, Narashti Ferenc died, likely due to long-standing illness and weakness in his legs. Although the widowed Ejebet was allowed to keep her holdings, she was to be supervised by a Lutheran magnate named Turso Jorge, who may have been previously tipped off about rumors of suspicious goings-on at Chaita Castle. In December 1610, Jorge and a company of other men, by the royal order of King Matyas II, raided the castle, finding more than enough damning evidence against Ejebet. The defaced bodies of several dead women and girls were discovered in the main rooms, as were victims who were miraculously still alive. The castle's dungeons had been converted into torture and extraction chambers, and journals where the Countess had written extensively about her victims seemed to tie it all together. Batri Ejebet, who was placed under house arrest, had 2 trials held against her in early January 1611. These were, in essence, show trials rather than actual justice. Ejebet herself did not participate, and the crowd that gathered was unanimously against her. Hundreds of witnesses and victims came to testify against the Countess, bringing with them detailed and gruesome accounts of Ejebet's cruelty, including accusations of cannibalism, torture by scissors, prodding with burning irons, satanic rituals, assistance from a pair of witches, and most dramatically, elevated spiked cages that showered her in fresh blood as the torture commenced. Her number of victims, which was inconsistent during the trials, was officially regarded as 80 women, but rumors at the time estimated her body count to be as high as 650. To the surprise of no one, Ejebet was declared guilty, but because she was a noble from a well-known family, local laws stated that she couldn't be executed. Instead, she was sentenced to spend the remainder of her life in solitary confinement, locked in the dungeon of Chaita Castle, where she died in August 1614 at 54 years of age. While the popular historical narrative has accepted Batri Ejebet as a heinous killer, revisionist historical analysis has instead suggested that her arrest was part of a political plot. It's likely that there was some truth in her attributed sadism, and that the ensuing sensationalist fervor added to its gravitas. In many regards, Ejebet was an unusual woman for her time and location. She was literate and fluent in 4 languages, she was a Calvinist at a time when such branches were seen as the most dangerously radical contingent of the Protestant Reformation, and, after the death of her husband, she was a widow holding a great amount of wealth and local authority. Perhaps it was due to the personal debts of King Matyas II, who owed money to reward Count Ferenc for his successful military campaigns. By having his widowed wife framed for murder, the Hungarian crown could step in and take the couple's lands, possessions, and fortunes without having to repay the debt. Also concerning the central authority of the land, Matyas II, or rather Matthias II, was not just the King of Hungary, but he was also the Holy Roman Emperor and a member of the von Habsburg family of Austria, leading others to believe that the arrest of Batri Ejebet was done as an act of contained Protestantism, or otherwise in advancement of ongoing Austrian influence. Either way, initial reactions to her death were surprisingly quiet. The so-called Blood Countess of Chaita wouldn't regain relevancy for well over a century after her burial. The first book concerning Batri Ejebet and her record as a serial killer was Tragica Istoria, written by the Hungarian Jesuit scholar Töröcsy László and published in 1729. The book largely preserved the rumors of her bloodbaths and high victim counts, though they were now exposed to a wider audience. By 1765, a number of the witness accounts at her trials, which had been maintained orally, began to be published, further contributing to the renewed interest in Batri Ejebet. Doubt in the authenticity of these stories came along around 1817, but this was drowned out by the revitalized sensationalism of the Countess's murders, which became a source of inspiration for the growing genre of vampire literature, as well as burgeoning psychologists seeking to understand the motivation and reasoning for such attributed cruelty. These two interests met in the second half of the 19th century, when the English Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould included the story of Batri Ejebet, whom he referred to as Elizabeth of Hungary, in his 1865 publication, The Book of Werewolves, an attempt to understand not only lycanthropy, but also selected historical several cases of madness and cruelty across Europe. Baring Gould's account of the Blood Countess, in turn, became one of the main inspirations for an Irish author named Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who, in 1871, published one of the quintessential works of vampire literature, Carmilla, a story about a lesbian vampire countess who feasts on the blood of girls and young women to sustain herself. And there's the link between Báthory Erzsébet and Carmilla. See, sometimes my tangents have a purpose. So now that we've all learned a hearty amount of Hungarian history in the past few minutes, we can see how the Fate franchise utilizes this information through Elizabeth and Carmilla. Admittedly, it doesn't really extend into their story prominence as much as other Fate characters I've talked about, considering that much of the time Elizabeth gets in the spotlight is dedicated to her recurring aspiration to become a pop idol singer. I mean, sure, she has moments of expressing vanity, cruelty, and anger like the tales of her historical counterpart, even more explicitly with Carmilla, but I'd be hard-pressed to find a solid link between the Blood Countess of Chaita and the Japanese idol singer. She's probably just reveling in her youth. Ah well, we might as well make do with what we still have. Starting with their designs, what we have here is emblematic of both sides of Báthory Erzsébet's history, her past and her future. Elizabeth's design not only represents the youth that the Blood Countess once possessed and later obsessed over maintaining, but her design also prominently includes a pair of horns, claw-like fingers, wings, and a reptilian tail, collectively evoking the image of a dragon, the central symbol of the House of Báthory. Adding to this, the spear she carries is named Sarkon Csontláncsa, Hungarian for Dragon Bone Lance. Though it seems a smidge morbid for her to be using a weapon that's apparently a dragon bone, when Elizabeth herself is clearly a dragon-humanoid hybrid. Even more so when she gets just as much, if not more, use out of it as a microphone stand. Oh wait, this is a figure to whom the word morbid is probably normalcy. Carmilla's design, meanwhile, pays homage to the Victorian Gothic vampire identity of Le Fanu's novel, with her alabaster skin, prominent bat motif, and color palette of black, white, and crimson red. Her design also evokes the historical sadism of Báthory Erzsébet through the inclusion of chains, spiked collars, and a portable Iron Maiden. But I'll get to talking about that last point in due time. Stepping away from Hungarian history for just a moment to go into the novella itself, Fate's incarnation of Carmilla also wears a distinctive mask obscuring the upper half of her face. Within the novella Carmilla, the titular vampire uses the opportunity of masquerade balls to stalk a number of potential victims, the mask obscuring her identity as she hunts. Onto the pair's assigned skills, there's a point of discrepancy here, as Elizabeth has slightly different kits between her appearance in Fate Extra CCC and in Fate Grand Order. And even within Fate Extra CCC, there's a distinction between her Lancer and Berserker incarnations. Starting with her original appearance as a Lancer in Fate Extra CCC, Elizabeth has the class skills Territory Creation B, which becomes important for her Noble Phantasm, and Battle Continuation B, which is largely used to explain her frequent rematches across the story. Not just in Fate Extra CCC either, but just about every appearance she's had. Quite a persistent Lancer she is. She also has the skills Charisma C, based on her authority as a noble, albeit a lower-ranked one, and Torture Technique A, based on the historical Báthory Erzsébet's inclination for abuse. As a Berserker, Elizabeth's class skills change to Magic Resistance A, from her Dragon heritage, and the more recognizable Madness Enhancement, though hers is at a very low E- rating. This allows her to retain her capacity for rational thought, while losing her ability to feel pain. Coupled with this, she also gets the skills Innocent Monster A, which enhances the dragon element of her behavior and attacks, and Mental Disorder A, which nullifies her ability to sense others' pain. The ultimate result is a new version of Elizabeth that's even stronger and even more driven by her own sadism than before. More or less a heightened representation of the monstrous reputation given to the historical Blood Countess. Elizabeth's kit in Fate Grand Order, meanwhile, is largely a rehash of her Lancer skills in Fate Extra CCC, but with two distinctions. One, she gets Magic Resistance A from her Berserker counterpart, and two, via a side quest, her Charisma C skill can be upgraded to Sadistic Charisma A, which grants an extra attack bonus to any female allies at her side, another element alluding to her historical reputation. In contrast, Carmilla's kit is noticeably shorter, and it's very straightforward to explain. Like any assassin-class servant, she has the class skill Presence Concealment, though only at a D rating because her historical crimes were initially obscured by the expanse of her homeland, progressively surfacing over time, similar to the historical Bathory Erzsébet. Torture Technique A needs no explanation since it's the exact same skill and rating that Elizabeth has, also sharing its historical inspiration. Vampirism C is described exactly as one would expect. Carmilla has the ability to regain strength and physical beauty from sucking out or bathing in blood, and this ties in with the last of her skills, Bath of Fresh Blood A. Strangely though, neither skill directly heals Carmilla in any capacity, but the former does increase Carmilla's Noble Phantasm gauge, which I'd say counts as regaining strength, especially considering what that attack does. Speaking of Noble Phantasms, I've saved them as our last point of comparison, to give this episode a flashy send-off. This ought to be a real treat too, as Elizabeth has two Noble Phantasms, one for her Lancer form and one for her Berserker form. But we've largely been giving Carmilla secondary treatment, so I say we start with hers instead. Carmilla's Noble Phantasm is Phantom Maiden Phantasmal Iron Maiden, in which she calls forth a large Iron Maiden to trap and pierce a single enemy, dealing extra damage if the target is female. After the damage is dealt, Carmilla will recover health and receive a bonus to her attack power. Although the Iron Maiden is a famous example of a torture device, and one that would suit a figure like Bathory Erzsébet, no evidence has been found proving that it existed prior to the 19th century, long after the Blood Countess's death. A clarification the Fate Grand Order does include. At least the healing and damage bonus to female targets are still accurate. As for Elizabeth, she has two Noble Phantasms, but they're both fairly similar to each other. In both incarnations, Elizabeth's Noble Phantasm is Bathory Erzsébet, Fresh Blood Demoness, in which she uses her territory creation skill to summon Chaita Castle behind her, using it as an amplifier for her singing voice, the shrieking becoming even more painful and unbearable because of this. Lancer Elizabeth gets her own Noble Phantasm, though, as I said, it's really more of a variation on Fresh Blood Demoness. This one is called Kilent Sharkon, Dragon Cry Thundering Voice. In a comparatively straightforward sense, this attack is a form of Dragon's Breath manifested from a combination of Elizabeth's shrieking voice and the roar of an ancient thunder dragon. Not quite as visually spectacular or dramatic, just more of a raw power version. And that's a wrap for today. There was a lot to cover with these two, and quite honestly, that made it one of the most difficult episodes to organize thus far. I still enjoyed researching and editing it, but whew, this really felt like a mental puzzle to unpack and then reassemble. Naturally, I can only cover so much within the finite minutes I have for each episode, and much of it has to be condensed down to what is most relevant to the topic character. There's a lot more fascinating history in the story of the real-life Bathory Erzsébet, such as her especially bitter legacy in modern-day Slovakia, the continuation of interest in her murders into the 20th century, the potential inspiration she had on Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, or the full downfall of the House of Bathory before the midpoint of the 17th century. So if you're interested in the topic after today's episode, I highly encourage you do some bonus reading in your own time. As it stands though, I'm very happy that I got my chance to talk about a piece of Hungarian history. It's not something that generalist historical lenses give much attention to, yet as Fate shows with its two interpretations of Bathory Erzsébet, it can be adapted with just as much creativity and aplomb as the more expected sources and locales. While these two might not be particular favorite servants of mine, their designs absolutely stick out to me. Doubly so, knowing how they express two sides of the same figure, like some kind of elaborate coin. If the two sides of the coin despised each other and sought the other's death. In any case, there's no doubt that Elizabeth will have another moment in the spotlight, and I'm curious to see what exactly that entails and where it may go. Also, can we get Szent István as a heroic spirit anytime soon, Type Moon? I'd be down for that.